Hello, fourth grade, and welcome to lesson 3 of our chapter on the Midwest. In this lesson, we're going to focus on how lakes and rivers contributed to the industrial growth of the Midwest. So when we're talking about industrial growth, we're talking about things like factories and the building of things more in a factory setting than people working on things at home. So in this lesson, we're going to use our investigative skills to explore how lakes and rivers contributed or helped the industrial growth in the Midwest. Over here, we have a picture. We'll look at the caption. It says, cities in the Midwest, like Detroit, Michigan, grew as more businesses and factories opened. So one of the biggest impacts of factories opening is that more people were moving closer to them because people had jobs in those areas. Let's go ahead and read our blue bars. Look at the title. What do you think this text will be about? Circle words you want to learn more about. Underline clues that tell you what were the problems of the time, who had these problems, and how did people try to solve these problems? Which words helped you identify problems African Americans were having? Underline problems that African Americans faced, and think about why did African Americans begin moving to northern cities? The Great Migration. Throughout much of the 1900s, laws in the South allowed discrimination against African Americans. For example, African Americans could not go to the same schools as whites or sit near white people in public places. In addition, economic conditions for African Americans in the South were poor due to sharecropping and struggling farm economy. During World War I, many Americans joined the Army. Northern factories needed workers to help with war production. They placed ads in newspapers in the South looking for workers. Large numbers of African Americans began moving to northern cities to take these jobs and to escape unfair laws. Many African Americans found jobs in northern factories. However, many of these jobs were difficult and unsafe. African Americans also faced discrimination in the North and the West. About 6 million African Americans migrated north and west between 1910 and 1970, looking for a better life. The African American population in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York City grew rapidly between 1910 and 1940. In the 1940s, many African Americans moved to cities in the West, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland. This movement of people would change America. Primary source. African Americans from the South moved to cities in the North during the Great Migration, looking for job opportunities. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our first graphic organizer. We're going to look at problems and solutions. Now for our problem and solution, our graphic organizer asks us who. So who is the group that we are talking about? What was the problem that they had and what solution did they have? So our who here is African Americans who were living in the South. The problem was that African Americans in the South were still facing a large amount of discrimination. One of the solutions they had was that many of them began moving north to find better jobs and to try and escape some of the unfair laws that they were having to deal with. For our next page in our larger graphic organizer, we're going to follow the same setup that we had in the small one. We're going to take a look at pages 204 to 213 in our textbook and fill in our graphic organizer. So for the first one, they gave us the who. They said the people of Chicago in 1871. We're going to figure out what the problem was and what the solution was. Waterways of the Midwest. The Northwest Ordinance provided a method of organizing the land known as the Northwest Territory. As settlers moved to develop this area, they formed the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Located near large lakes, this area came to be known as the Great Lakes region. There are 5 Great Lakes: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. These 5 lakes represent the largest surface area of fresh water in the world. 8 states in the United States border the Great Lakes. Canada borders the Great Lakes to the north. The Great Lakes provided access to the ocean for many inland cities. They were first connected to the Atlantic Ocean by the Erie Canal. Now the St. Lawrence Seaway connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. Canals and rivers connect the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Because of this water access, cities along the Great Lakes can trade with other parts of the world. Cities located on the Great Lakes rapidly grew as trade and industry helped bring people and jobs to the region. Let's take a look at our timeline here. 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroys much of the city. 1904, the Model T Ford automobile is introduced. 1914, the first traffic light is installed in Cleveland, Ohio. And in 1916, the Great Migration begins. Here we can see in this picture, cities located on the Great Lakes, such as Detroit, Michigan, trade with the rest of the world. All right, let's move on to our next page. From forts to industry. Some cities in the Midwest started as fur trading posts. As these posts grew, the United States wanted to protect these areas. The government began building forts to protect these growing towns and cities. In the 1800s, Fort Dearborn was built to protect the trading post that would become the city of Chicago. In Ohio, the government built Fort Industry to protect the area that would become the city of Toledo. In the mid-1800s, the cities located on the Great Lakes grew, thanks to the access to resources and water. Farmers shipped their crops. Loggers shipped lumber. Miners shipped iron ore. People wanted faster, more direct ways to ship goods. As a result, canals were built to connect major waterways. In 1848, the Illinois and Michigan Canal was completed in Illinois. This canal helped to directly link Lake Michigan with the Mississippi River. This also shifted the center of trade in the Midwest from St. Louis to Chicago. As trade along the waterways increased, cities on the Great Lakes and connecting rivers began to boom. People moved to these cities because of the jobs that were available there. For example, Chicago became the world's busiest lumber port in 1870s. Factories were built in the Midwest, often along rivers or on the Great Lakes. In 1870, most of the buildings in Chicago were built of wood. There were even wooden sidewalks. On October 8, 1871, a fire broke out on the southwest side of the city. Because so much of the city was wood, the fire spread quickly. The Great Chicago Fire burned more than 24 hours and ruined a section of the city that was about 4 miles long and 1 mile wide. The fire killed hundreds of people. The rebuilding of the city was called the Great Rebuilding. Chicago's builders rebuilt many structures using steel rather than wood. Steel is made from iron ore. This change helped protect the city against huge fires. The demand for steel also helped the iron ore industry to grow. So when we're talking about the people in Chicago in 1871 for our graphic organizer, our problem is that buildings and sidewalks were made of wood, and this is what contributed to the spread of the Chicago fire, which burned down so much of the city and caused so many deaths. So as a solution, after the fire, when people began rebuilding, they used different materials such as steel instead of wood to help protect the city from any future fires. The steel industry. Iron ore was discovered in Michigan in 1844. The iron ore industry first grew because of the railroads. Iron ore was used to make train engine cars and rails. It was mined and shipped to places like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. A new process for making steel was developed in the 1880s. The steel was lighter and easier to make. As a result, steel became more affordable. Since it was lighter, it was also easier to use to construct buildings and bridges. Steel made it possible to construct tall buildings called skyscrapers. The first skyscrapers were 10 to 20 stories tall. Steel was also used to build major bridges over the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. This new demand for steel led to the building of steel plants along the Great Lakes. The city of Gary, Indiana was built because of the growth of the steel industry. People came to Gary, Indiana because of the jobs available there. In 1914, World War I started. As the United States prepared for the war, the need for steel increased. This created jobs for people to make weapons and equipment needed for war. The auto industry. In 1903, Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company in Michigan. In 1908, the company built an automobile called the Model T Ford, and it used an assembly line to make automobiles. Workers assembled the same parts for each automobile as it reached their spot on the assembly line. This allowed for the mass production of automobiles, which means that a lot of automobiles could be built in a short amount of time. Ford paid his workers well. Many were able to buy an automobile like those they were making. This was one of the reasons why people wanted to work for the Ford Motor Company. Working conditions were not great in all factories, though. Many workers faced problems in their jobs. In response, workers joined together to form unions. Unions are groups of workers who fight for fair pay and safe working conditions. Other automobile companies opened manufacturing plants in Michigan in the 1900s. As a result, Detroit became known as the Motor City. So for our next section in our graphic organizer, the who that we can talk about are factory workers. And the problem that they had was that many of them faced really poor working conditions. So as a result, they banded together and they formed unions to help fight to improve working conditions and pay for different factory workers. The Great Migration. World War I began in Europe in 1914. Initially, the United States did not join the war, but companies did begin to produce war supplies. Factories needed workers to make these supplies. Beginning in 1916, many African Americans who lived in the South began moving north for these jobs. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, many men went off to war. This left factories in need of more workers. Factories in the North placed ads in newspapers and magazines to attract workers. As a result, African Americans moved from the South to the northern cities such as Chicago, New York, and Detroit. They traveled by boat, railroad, and car. This movement of people was known as the Great Migration. African Americans also moved to escape discrimination, segregation, and violent acts against them in the South. Even though many African Americans found jobs in the North, they often faced discrimination and poor working conditions. Many were not welcomed in established neighborhoods. The African Americans who came added to the culture in the northern cities. Some wrote books and poems about what it was like to be an African American in the United States. They built churches and opened restaurants. As a result, northern cities along the Great Lakes became more diverse. Garrett Morgan. Garrett Morgan was an inventor. He was born in Kentucky in 1877. When he was a teenager, he had several jobs at sewing factories. Through these jobs, he learned how to fix sewing machines. He invented a way to improve sewing machines and opened his own sewing machine repair business. In 1914, Morgan invented a breathing device that was a safety hood. It allowed people to breathe when covered in smoke. Because Morgan was an African American, people hesitated to buy it. Morgan hired a white person to help him sell his product. Once people saw how his invention worked, they realized its benefits. Morgan's invention protected soldiers from poisonous gases in World War I. Firefighters and rescue workers also used it. In 1916, an explosion in a tunnel in Cleveland trapped workers underground near gas fumes. Morgan and others used his breathing devices to save 2 workers. Surprisingly, the rescue hurt sales of the breathing device. Following this event, many people learned that Morgan was African American. Some people refused to buy the device because he was African American. Morgan was the first African American in Cleveland to own an automobile. After seeing a car accident, he thought of an idea to help traffic flow. He invented a traffic signal that was an early form of the modern-day traffic signal. So for our next part of our graphic organizer, our who is going to be Garrett Morgan. The problem that he faced was that people couldn't breathe when they were surrounded by smoke. This is the problem that he was trying to tackle. So as a solution, he designed a safety hood to help people breathe. So something that would go over their heads to help protect them from smoke. Immigration and the Midwest. Over time, many immigrants from Europe moved to the United States. Some left their home countries to escape bad situations. Others came to the United States in the hopes of finding a job. Immigrants settled in the Midwest cities such as Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Milwaukee. They took jobs in the steel industry, auto industry, and other factories. Many immigrants helped build major railroads, canals, and bridges. When immigrants arrived in cities, they often moved into neighborhoods with other people who spoke the same language. Often immigrants faced discrimination. They worked difficult or dangerous jobs for low pay. Eventually, immigrants were able to join labor unions to help improve their working conditions. Immigrants often struggled when they came to the United States. Being so far from home and not knowing the English language was difficult. Some Americans, like Jane Addams, worked to help immigrants. Addams created Hull House in Chicago to help immigrants succeed. Workers at Hull House watched children while their parents went to work. At Hull House, immigrants learned English and other skills. Some immigrants were able to take English classes at their factories where they worked. Influences of immigrants. Large groups of immigrants with similar traditions moved to the same areas. For example, many Germans moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Because of this, Milwaukee is a place that has a lot of German foods and cultural influences. Many people from Norway and Sweden moved to Minnesota. Scandinavian traditions from that part of the world are still common today in Minnesota. In 1908, many people from Vietnam began migrating to Minneapolis, Minnesota. In recent times, large groups of immigrants from Central America, South America, and Africa have moved to the Midwestern cities. Large cities offer a diverse range of cultures for people to experience. Immigrants today can still face discrimination or struggle to adapt to the new language and culture. However, the immigrants find success in their new country. People can usually find a place to celebrate their traditions of their home countries to keep their heritage alive. Now, for the last section of our graphic organizer, we can talk about some of the immigrants that came to Chicago. The problem that they faced was that immigrants were struggling to adapt to life in a new country and to learn a language that wasn't their native language. And one of the solutions was that immigrants looked for places that offered help, such as the Hull House, that allowed them to work and have someone to care for their children while also teaching them the English language. Once you've neatly completed your graphic organizer, we're going to go into our next page. So we're going to look at our Write About It section, and it says define. It says, what are the Great Lakes? So here you can explain what they are, where they're located, and what they connect. You can also talk about the kind of water that's found in the Great Lakes. So you have plenty of lines here. Please use lots of detail in your answer. In the Write and Cite Evidence section, why do different people move to cities near the Great Lakes? Use facts from the text to explain your response. So you can't just give an answer. You also need to pull examples from the reading to support your answer. So here you can talk about things like job opportunities and factories. You can talk about why people came maybe to escape a difficult situation in their homes. Maybe they were coming to try and get away from discrimination and so on. So give lots of examples to support your answer. And then next in the pull it together section, under where it says connect to the essential question, name 3 ways the growth of cities in the Midwest reflect the spirit of America. So here you can talk about innovations, about industrial development. You can talk about people coming in hopes of building a better life for themselves and for their families and so on. So pull from the things that we read about in the text to write your answer. Please make sure you use complete sentences, check your spelling and grammar while you're writing, make sure you use the correct punctuation. And if you have any questions about this lesson, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have an amazing day. Take care. Bye-bye.